Here's a number that should genuinely confuse you if you think about it for more than a few seconds. The median household enters retirement having replaced somewhere between 55% and 65% of their pre-retirement income once you account for every source combined. Social Security, modest savings, whatever pension might still exist. And the standard advice, repeated across nearly every retirement planning resource for decades, says you need roughly 70% to 80% of pre-retirement income to maintain your standard of living once you stop working. Sit with that gap for a second. The median household isn't falling short of an ambitious target. They're falling short of the baseline minimum that financial planning itself defines as adequate. Not by a little, by a margin large enough that the math simply doesn't reconcile. My name is Dave, and I love taking the numbers that retirement planning conversations usually keep abstract and showing you exactly what they translate to month by month, year by year, for an actual person living an actual retirement. Today, we're going through what the middle class genuinely retires with. Not the headline savings number you've probably already seen somewhere, the income replacement reality underneath it, and the specific way that reality changes as retirement actually unfolds. Because the version most people plan for and the version most people live turn out to be two very different things. Let's build the income replacement picture piece by piece because each source contributes less than most people assume. Social Security first. The average monthly benefit currently runs around $1,900, or roughly $22,800 a year. For a household where both spouses worked and both draw benefits, combined household Social Security income typically lands somewhere between $30,000 and $38,000 annually, depending on each person's earnings history. Compare that to median household income during peak working years, which sits around $80,000. Social Security alone, even with two benefits combined, replaces somewhere between 38% and 48% of that pre-retirement income. Not the 70% to 80% target, less than half from the single largest guaranteed income source most retirees have. Now add savings. The median retirement account balance for households actually, at retirement age, 65 to 74, sits around $200,000 to $250,000 once you combine all account types for households that have any retirement savings at all. Applying the standard 4% withdrawal guideline, that produces somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 in additional annual income. Combined, Social Security at roughly $34,000 plus savings withdrawal at roughly $9,000 puts the median household at approximately $43,000 in annual retirement income. Against a pre-retirement income of $80,000, that's a replacement ratio of about 54%, not 70%, not 80%, 54%. And that's the optimistic version of the calculation because it assumes the household actually has retirement savings in the first place, which roughly a quarter of households approaching retirement age genuinely don't. Here's where the gap becomes a lived problem, rather than just an uncomfortable spreadsheet number. A household that spent $80,000 a year for 3 decades doesn't naturally know how to live on $43,000. The habits, the assumptions, the baseline sense of what a normal month costs, all of it was calibrated against a number that just dropped by nearly half. This is where the standard retirement calculator assumption starts to break down, and it's worth naming specifically why. Most retirement planning tools assume a flat or even rising spending pattern throughout retirement, the same real spending level adjusted upward for inflation every year for 25 or 30 years. Researchers studying actual retiree spending patterns have documented something different, often called the retirement spending smile. Spending tends to be relatively high in the first few years of retirement, while retirees are healthy and active and spending on travel and the things they plan to retirement around. It then declines meaningfully through the middle retirement years as activity naturally decreases and the novelty of early retirement settles into routine. Then it rises sharply again in later retirement, driven almost entirely by one category: healthcare and long-term care costs. The middle-class household planning around a flat spending assumption is planning for a curve that doesn't actually match how retirement spending behaves. They're often comfortable in the early years, which reinforces a false sense that the plan is working, right before the second half of that smile starts climbing in a direction nobody budgeted the same way for. Let's talk about healthcare specifically, because this is the category that breaks more retirement plans than any other single line item. Medicare doesn't begin until 65, which is itself a planning gap for anyone retiring earlier. But even after Medicare coverage begins, it doesn't cover everything. Premiums, supplemental coverage, deductibles, and crucially, most dental, vision, and long term care costs fall outside standard Medicare coverage entirely. Fidelity's widely cited research on retiree healthcare costs estimates that an average retired couple today will need approximately $315,000 to cover healthcare expenses throughout retirement, not including long term care. That figure has climbed substantially over the past 2 decades and shows no sign of leveling off. Here's what makes this number so dangerous for the median household we just calculated. $315,000 is more than the entire retirement savings balance most middle class households have at retirement, before a single dollar of regular living expenses gets covered. The healthcare number alone, spread across a 20 to 25-year retirement, requires roughly $13,000 to $16,000 a year just for healthcare. Layer that onto the $43,000 total income we calculated earlier, and healthcare alone consumes close to a third of total retirement income for the median household, a category that barely existed as a budget line item during working years when employer coverage absorbed most of the cost. Now let's talk about the risk that almost never gets factored into household retirement planning at all, even though it's arguably the single largest variable in whether the math works out. Longevity. The Social Security Administration's own life expectancy tables show that a 65-year-old today has, on average, a meaningful chance of living past 90. For a married couple, the odds that at least one spouse lives past 90 are considerably higher than most people intuitively expect. Here's why this matters so much for the income replacement math we built earlier. Every calculation assumes a retirement length. Most household budgeting, even when people do it carefully, implicitly assumes something like 20 years. Plan for 20, live 28, and the entire structure of withdrawal rates, savings depletion timing, and Social Security adequacy shifts dramatically in a direction nobody planned for. The 4% withdrawal guideline itself was originally researched against roughly 30-year retirement horizons specifically because of this risk. But the median household's $200,000 to $250,000 balance, even withdrawn conservatively, simply doesn't have enough mass to survive both inflation and a multi-decade horizon at a withdrawal rate that also needs to cover the healthcare costs we just discussed. The brutal version of this reality is straightforward. The median middle-class household isn't just retiring with less income than they're used to. They're retiring with a financial structure that was sized for a shorter, flatter, cheaper retirement than the one actual life expectancy and actual healthcare cost data suggest they're likely to experience. Here's what this actually means for someone reading this who hasn't retired yet. The gap between the 70 to 80% replacement target and the 54% median reality isn't primarily a math problem you solve by working slightly longer or cutting expenses slightly more aggressively in the final years before retirement. The gap is large enough, and the underlying drivers, healthcare cost growth, longevity, the spending smile, are structural enough that closing it requires action well before retirement arrives, not adjustments made in the final approach to it. The specific moves that actually shift this math meaningfully. Increasing the savings rate now while there's still genuine compounding time remaining, which we covered the exact mechanics of in a previous video on the 40-year-old catch-up math. Treating healthcare cost projection as its own dedicated line item in retirement planning rather than an assumed footnote absorbed into general living expenses. Stress testing any retirement plan against a 30-year horizon rather than a 20-year one, given what the actuarial data actually shows about how long people are living. And being honest, well before retirement, about what percentage of pre-retirement income the plan actually replaces, rather than discovering the real number for the first time after the paychecks have already stopped. Here's the uncomfortable summary of what the middle class actually retires with. Not financial catastrophe in most cases. Not the picture of a generation collapsing into poverty. Something quieter and arguably more insidious than that. A retirement income that replaces a little over half of what working life provided, against a target that assumed closer to 3/4. A spending curve that looks manageable in the early, comfortable years and climbs sharply later, exactly when the savings have already been drawn down the longest. A healthcare cost category large enough to consume a third of total income that barely existed as a budget line a decade earlier. and a longevity risk that means the whole structure needs to survive years longer than most people's mental model of retirement assumes. None of this is unsolvable, but it's only solvable with enough runway in front of it to actually change the trajectory. The brutal reality isn't that retirement is impossible for the middle class. It's that most of the middle class is building toward it using assumptions that the actual data quietly stopped supporting years ago.